The Soviet Union now dominated the nations along its western border. At first, Stalin did not impose a Soviet system on his new empire. Instead, he built up pro-Soviet coalition governments, but the communists made sure that the police and security were in their hands. The Yalta Conference had given Russia control of Central Europe.
We knew perfectly well what the Russians interpreted as democracy and all that, but then we were allies fighting a war together. We couldn't very well say to Stalin, now we are going to write down our interpretation of Western democracy and you've got to sign up and say this is your interpretation. It wasn't possible.
We began to receive cables from American representatives in the what we were all later to call the satellite countries on the behavior of Soviet troops with respect to the people of Poland, of Bulgaria, Romania, Yugoslavia, and so on. So trouble was in the air.
What would happen is that such and such a prominent member of the Peasant Party of Bulgaria would be kidnapped, simply would disappear. Or other figures who were not acceptable for inclusion in the People's Democratic new regimes would be disappeared.
In Berlin, where the Allies jointly supervised city life, the communists were careful.
The idea was at the beginning to cooperate and gradually to build up the party, making the best organized party, the most militant party, the most active party, and gradually increase the influence on the other parties, and gradually take over the whole situation, but not at once. We should already prepare for building up the police. The man for personnel, changes personnel. The man for education. So we were flabbergasted. We only 3 or 4 comrades and everybody else are social democrats and bourgeois democrats and so on. So one of us asked and said, it must look democratic, but we must have everything in our hands.
Many Germans perfectly well understood that brown, the Nazi colors, were becoming red overnight. After all, the methods in some ways were the same, or at any rate very similar, of forcing people to do things against their will.
Poland. In the wreckage of Warsaw, the Poles began to clear the ruins. The Poles had fought the Germans on every front, east and west. Now they worked together to rebuild their country. Some loathed the new semi-communist government tied to Moscow, but others found reasons to accept it and live with it.
The most important thing for me was for my mother and sister to come from Siberia and for us to begin rebuilding the country. We also needed to secure our borders, which were seriously threatened. Staying in the army gave me that chance.
In Moscow, Poland's new puppet leaders were taken to the opera. The Poles agreed to a close alliance with the Soviet Union. Stalin promised to defend the new Polish frontiers against any German attempt to win back the lost territories.